Hello, I'm Jonathon Mellor. You're listening to Raw 1251 AM. I'm joined here today by Sam Bowman from the Adam Smith Institute. Thank you very much for coming today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Lovely. We'll start it off quite controversial. What's your opinion on universal basic income or an equivalent? What do you think should be done in the future with regard to that?
I think a basic income is fundamentally a good idea. We have a very expensive welfare state that's very, very complex. It's a kind of patchwork quilt of decades and decades of new forms of welfare being introduced to solve different problems. And that's led to one that often those different forms of welfare interact in ways that are bad, and they disincentivize people from working because you lose, let's say, 70 pence of benefits for every £1 you earn. So it's effectively a tax rate of 70%. So it's no surprise that people are trapped on benefits in that respect. However, we do want to give people money. We do want to give people on low incomes money. So something like a basic income as a replacement for a lot of the welfare that we give might be a good way of doing that. Now, my preference is for something called a negative income tax, which is like a basic income, but we withdraw it in a way that we can kind of control the rate of withdrawal. So instead of a 70p tax rate, we give you, let's say, a 50p or a 40p tax rate. The advantage of that over a basic income is that with a basic income, we either have to raise taxes significantly, and we're doing that really to just pay a lot of people who don't need this money, or we have to set it so low that it's not enough for people to survive on, and that's bad. A negative income tax is a lot more targeted, but it achieves this goal of giving people money and doing so in a way that doesn't put them off working.
Excellent. Your talk today was primarily on how the free markets can help the poor. Quite briefly, how would you, in a nutshell, say how that would work?
My argument is twofold. The first point is that markets have already done a lot to help the poor. And even within the last 30 years, since the kind of Thatcher government, which most people consider to be the sort of beginning of neoliberalism, and I embrace that term, in the UK, I think the data is very strong that the UK has done really, really well, particularly people at the bottom, whose incomes have nearly tripled in real terms since 1988. That's a really, really important statistic, and it's something that people don't realise. And that hasn't actually come. We haven't had rising inequality. Inequality rose in the 80s, but it stayed there. And we recently, just this week, found that inequality is at its lowest point in the last 30 years. So that's a really, really surprising statistic. Wealth inequality is similar. My second point is that for the things that really matter for people, cost of living and income, the best solutions are taking out government, are removing back some of the regulations. The big ones are housing, so making it easier to build both on greenbelt land, especially intensive farmland, which is really not very green at all. It's really bad for the environment, and in terms of childcare, putting our regulations to do with childcare more or less in line with those of Denmark or Sweden or Germany, where it's not so tightly regulated, and as a result it's a lot less expensive, so poorer people can put their kids into childcare, and especially poorer women can get into work and save some money. On the other point, I think we should redesign the tax system so that we're not taxing investment, but we are taxing the consumption of the rich more than we're taxing the consumption of the poor. That would give us a system that had as much growth as possible, because we know growth is good for everybody, particularly people at the bottom, but it would also allow us to have a proportional tax system that taxed the rich more than the poor, which is, I think, a great outcome for everyone.
The free market is generally considered the most efficient method of economics, but how would you propose balancing that with fairness?
Well, it's a really important question, because what I often say is that markets are really efficient, but nature can be very cruel. So not everybody has talents that they can make a lot of money off. Markets, I think, when we let them work, are very good at paying people what their economic value is worth, but your economic value might be low, but your value as a human being is, of course, very high. So how do we square that circle? For me, and this is what I actually think kind of neoliberalism is actually about, if we can try and define it, because most people who use the word don't define it, they just use it as a term of abuse. I want to define it. I think it means having fairly deregulated markets that create a lot of wealth, and then a fairly simple system for taxing the rich and giving to the poor in a way that doesn't put the poor off working and doesn't put the rich off investing. We want to maximize growth, we want to maximize wealth, and then we want to just through a simple basic income or a negative income tax, give money to the poor. And that, I think, is the best way of maximizing the size of the pie and then also giving people a fair share.
Why do you believe that some major political parties haven't outspokenly supported the specific ideas you've laid out of neoliberalism, such as the Conservative Party?
Well, the big reason the Conservative Party doesn't want to do anything about planning and housing, even though it's the number one issue, I think, for a lot of people, particularly young people. A lot of people listening will probably wonder, like me, if they're ever going to be able to buy a house. The reason is that their voters own their houses, and that the point of planning reform is for houses to become cheaper. Now, if you're somebody who's retired and you spent your whole life spending money on your mortgage, and the only asset you earn is your house, and the government or some political party comes out and says, hey, guess what, we've got a great policy that's going to cut these values by 30%. Now, if you're poor, it's great. If you don't own a house, it's great. If you own a house, you lose out. So that's one reason, that it's kind of naked self-interest in that respect. Mm-hmm. Another reason is that there are difficulties in passing these things to do with knowledge. Most of what I try to base what I kind of say on the empirical evidence. That's not to say that everybody who looks at the evidence will agree with me, but what we find is that economists disagree a lot less than you might think about a lot of these things. Very few economists, I think, would argue that planning reform is a bad idea. Very few economists, whether they're of the left or the right, would argue that shifting taxation from capital, from investment towards consumption is a bad idea if you can do it in a way that doesn't hit the poor. The problem is that the average voter isn't that knowledgeable about economics, isn't that knowledgeable about politics. So as a political party, you don't give a what economists say. You want to know what the voters are saying, and that can often be self-defeating. Voters can often have a bad idea about, even as they would judge their own outcomes, a bad idea about what policies they favour. It's a real problem, but I don't know how we can get around it except going out, having debates and arguing about it in public.
For the first time in arguably recorded history of their nation, in 2016, more jobs were lost to automation than to overseas workers in the US. How would you suggest rectifying the situation or indeed embracing it?
Well, automation is an amazing thing because, of course, it creates jobs as well as destroying them. But somebody said to me once, and it's always stuck in my mind, automation and technology is a little bit like getting to Australia. The journey is awful, but it's great when you get there. The more automation we have, the more money we have overall, the richer we are overall. Things like driverless cars are really going to change. Most people don't have any idea how much driverless cars are going to change our lives, because they're suddenly going to mean you don't need to live in cities. They're suddenly going to mean we can do transport for very, very little price. It's going to change a lot. But, of course, a lot of people who have jobs to do with transportation are going to lose those jobs. The 2 things we need to do, actually the 3 things. Number 1, not do anything to restrict that kind of technological advance, because those sort of technological advancements are the things that raise our living standards overall. Number 2, try to make it as easy as possible for new kinds of jobs to come about. We're very lucky in the UK that we have a very flexible labour market. That's one of the reasons, I think, why we did quite well in terms of jobs after the crisis, but a lot of European countries have not done very well. We need to continue that and make it easy for kind of flexible work to come forward. And third, honestly, I do think that it goes back to this basic income or negative income tax idea, which is if people find that they just can't do that much, that robots aren't able to do more cheaply, we don't want them to be left without anything. We also don't want them to vote against technology. We don't want them to elect kind of Trump-style people who hate driverless cars as much as Trump hates China. We want a situation where everybody is getting something out of this advancement, even if their own work is being kind of threatened in a way. And that's why I think this redistributive element as part of a deregulated economy is so important.
It wouldn't be a political economic interview in the past year or two without mentioning Brexit. How do you feel from a free market perspective it's going to affect the UK?
Well, I was personally against Brexit. I voted to remain. Some of my colleagues were pro-Brexit and they voted to leave. I think as a free marketeer, the question is, are the opportunities from being able to trade with the rest of the world worth not having bigger trade barriers with Europe? So even if we don't have any tariffs with Europe, there are things called non-tariff barriers, which are kind of regulations and rules that countries use to keep out goods from abroad. Now, part of the single market means that it's really difficult to set those up. They do exist, particularly for things like services, but they're much lower, and it's much easier to sell your goods kind of ignoring tariffs. My fear is that if we leave the EU single market, then we're going to find that it's much more difficult for us to sell our goods and to sell our services like banking and finance and legal services to the continent, and that could make us poorer. On the other hand, there are opportunities. We're probably going to get a trade deal with the US before the EU does. I think the fact that we don't have as many vested interests just because we're smaller it's in our favour. Obviously, the fact that we're smaller means it's less attractive to get a deal with us, but I think it might actually work out in our favour in this one. A big one for me is that genetically modified organisms are I think crazily tightly regulated in the EU in a way that no other sane developed country does, and I think it's really holding back biological technology. It's holding back the price of food. It's a really, really bad idea, and we can change that outside the EU, which would be a good thing. So I'm pessimistic. I don't think it's going to lead to massive job losses. I think we're a bit poorer as a result, but it may be that with the right policy we can make it work.
There's a conception about free marketeers or neoliberals that some people believe they're synonymous with crony capitalism or exploitative systems. Could you give examples where the free markets can be used to help other areas, not just the poor?
Sure. Well, I mean, a great example of crony capitalism is what's going on with Nissan at the moment. The government is probably, we don't know for sure, but the government is probably bribing Nissan, just giving them cash to stay in Newcastle, because it would be bad for voters. Wouldn't like it. It goes back to the voting issue. Voters wouldn't like it. Now that's crony capitalism. That's appalling, and we should be opposing that. If Nissan is not willing to base itself in Newcastle on the basis of the actual strengths and weaknesses of that, that's it. We should be opposing that, and I think it's very important. When it comes to things in our day-to-day lives, in London at least, Uber versus black cab drivers is a really, really big issue, and black cab drivers are effectively a vested interest. They're a really, really big vested interest, and Uber is disrupting that. Uber is just providing a better product at a cheaper price in a more convenient way. It's better in every possible respect, in my opinion. The only way that black cab drivers can compete against Uber is by lobbying the government to make it harder for Uber to work on the streets of London. It's really important for free marketeers to fight stuff like that, because consumers lose out, and free marketeers always need to remember that it's consumers. That's everybody. Everybody is a consumer. Are the people that we're fighting on the side of. The final point is the really big one, which is the financial system. Bailouts for banks in 2008. It may have been that once we got to that point, they were the only possible policy. I'm not certain, but that might be the case. But now that we've gone through that, it's possible as well that the bailout policy incentivized banks to do what they did. We don't know for sure. But now that we've gone through that, we should be making it much, much more difficult for banks to operate without the sort of capital reserves that they need to, if they go bust, sort themselves out, bail out their own depositors to the extent that they need to, and let their bondholders just burn. Because the government getting involved in that and the government propping up bad banks in that way, I think adds a huge amount of rot to the system, and it's a very, very long-running rot. We don't want that, and free marketeers, neoliberals, need to fight that as much as people who object to it on other bases do. Because markets can't, in the same way you can't have heaven without hell, you can't have profit without loss. It's really, really important that we keep that loss in the system.
Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, I'm Sam Bowman. I'm Executive Director of the Adam Smith Institute, and you're listening to Raw 12:51 AM.